This is the America's Quarterly Podcast. I'm Brian Winter. Mexico is under pressure, not just from the incoming Donald Trump administration, but from souring sentiment among investors at home. Today on the podcast, a broad look at U.S.-Mexico negotiations and other risks ahead over the next few months.
I am not seeing a disastrous scenario. I'm not seeing anything catastrophic like, the crisis that we had in 1994, 1995. But what I am seeing is a continuous deterioration of many things. Institutions, economic growth, trade institutions, regulatory framework.
Donald Trump isn't even in office yet, and we've already seen fireworks between him and Mexico's President, Claudia Sheinbaum, as the two leaders begin what is sure to be a contentious, protracted, and unpredictable negotiation over migration, control of the U.S.-Mexico border, and trade. The question everybody has is, how bad could things get for Mexico, given Trump's threat of tariffs of up to 25%, and the fact that Mexico sends about 80% of its exports to the United States. Some people believe that Trump is just negotiating, using the threat of tariffs to bring Mexico, Canada, and others to the table so he can eventually cut a deal. I have to confess, I'm not so sure. I've wondered if a newly emboldened Donald Trump really is interested in divorce, a fundamental split with Mexico, which he has blamed for years for a variety of ills in the United States, from irregular immigration to the opioid epidemic and the loss of U.S. manufacturing jobs. So today on the podcast, we wanted to dive more deeply into the U.S.-Mexico question, to think about President Sheinbaum's negotiating strategy, and also look at some of the other storm clouds gathering for the Mexican economy. Our guest is Valeria Moy. Valeria is the director of the Instituto Mexicano para la Competitividad, a think tank based in Mexico City, and a member of AQ's editorial board. Valeria, welcome back to the AQ podcast.
Thank you, Brian. It's my pleasure to be here.
So, Valeria, as I noted in the introduction, it has already been a turbulent couple of weeks for Mexico following the election of Donald Trump. How would you describe Mexico's strategy toward Trump so far?
I don't know, Brian, to answer specifically your question, if we have a strategy. We saw at the beginning, first, it was the Ministry of the Economy, Marcelo Ebrard, who said when Donald Trump made his first threat that the main strategy that Mexico would have was to keep a cold head, to keep focused and to keep patient and to be quiet and to think and to be more strategic than to be replying or responding to every threat that the president of the United States would do. And it was okay. I mean, I agree with that. But 2 days after that statement, he said that to every tariff that President Trump tried to impose on Mexico, Mexico would hit back with another tariff. So it was like, okay, that was how long it lasted, our cool head strategy, like, come on, like really 2 days. And when even President Trump hasn't even taken office. So for me, it's very clear that we don't have a strategy yet. And then we saw a more complicated tone in the post that President-elect Trump had on that social media outlet, where he said that he was going to hit every product that came from Mexico and from Canada with a 25% tariff. And the next day, President Claudia Sheinbaum responded in her morning press conference that Mexico was going to hit back. And actually, the phrase was something like, for every tariff, we will have another tariff coming. it's very weird to hear that when, of course, we are partners. So the conversation, it doesn't sound like a partnership conversation or like like a friendly conversation. Like, yes, we are partners, and then we're threatening each other with tariffs. So I don't know if we have a strategy.
Yeah, and to be fair, it's a difficult situation for Mexico. If there is such a thing as an asymmetrical power dynamic in a negotiation, this is one of them. I mean, Mexico is so dependent upon the United States. You mentioned that the atmospherics around the dialogue have not exactly been friendly. Well, they're not friendly coming from the United States either. At the same time, my impression from the outside in, Valeria, has been that that the Mexicans are still kind of trying to figure it out and maybe doing multiple things. I mean, on the one hand, signaling a willingness to speak. And Claudia Sheinbaum has posted photos now twice of herself speaking to Donald Trump on the phone. She was smiling in both photos, which was an obvious attempt to kind of set a friendly tone. But at the same time, it also seems that, in any negotiation, if you cave right away and only show a willingness to talk, the other party is just going to ask for more and more and more and push you around. I mean, we know Donald Trump at this point. We know how he operates. So maybe it's a little bit of everything.
And I do agree with that. I think that Mexico is in a very tough spot. So, Brian, yes, I do think that we still don't know what will happen. We're trying to figure it out. But what I think is that we're going to face, and again, when I say we, it's Mexico, that we're going to face a different President Trump. I am not sure that we're going to have the same Trump that Mexico had some years ago. I think that we're going to have an emboldened President Trump, that he's not going to look for re-election, that he's going to try to bring this nearshoring, whatever real or unreal that idea is, but that he's going to try to have that investment to the U.S. Because, of course, for the U.S., the conversation is not about nearshoring, but about reshoring and bringing that investment back to the U.S., and that he's willing to go long ways to get that. And I do think we are facing the same Trump that we faced many years ago. So in that regard, I don't know if the language, let me use this parallel, the language that we learned to speak at that moment in time is going to be the same. I think we're not going to be able to speak the exact same language. We're going to face a different Trump with different ideas and with different threats to Mexico.
Yeah, I agree with you, Valeria, in part because the circumstances are different in the United States this time. Donald Trump has a stronger mandate. He has control of both houses of Congress. And some of the moderating influences that were around him the first time. I mean, in the Mexican case, what at first the Peña Nieto government did, and then López Obrador, when that government came in 2018, 2 years into the Trump administration, was every time Trump made one of these threats, they'd send somebody to Washington, whether it was the foreign minister, Luis Videgaray, or Marcelo Ebrard, and they'd go find these pretty sympathetic interlocutors at the White House, like Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, or John Kelly, who was then his chief of staff. And somehow they would prevail upon Trump not to follow through on these threats to either close the border or unilaterally drop out of NAFTA without negotiating a new deal, and so on. And this time around, not only are Jared Kushner and John Kelly gone, but they've been replaced by people like Mike Waltz. Mike Waltz, who will be the new national security advisor, as a Florida congressman last year, proposed legislation authorizing the use of military force in Mexico. So it's a very different cast of characters around Donald Trump. You have Marco Rubio as Secretary of State as well. I don't think any of them are extremists necessarily, just to be really clear on that, but they might also not be the ones who were in Trump's ear really advocating for the status quo in the way that people were 6, 7, or 8 years ago.
Yes, and exactly those appointments make it very clear, or should make it very clear for Mexico to see that we're facing a different threat. From my perspective, Brian, it's not about trade. This is not about trade. This is about so many other things. And we are bundling everything together. Yes, President Trump does that. I mean, when we had to revisit the former NAFTA deal, President Trump forced Mexico and Canada in a way to bundle everything together. And instead of having these, different avenues for trade and a different avenue for migration, a different avenue for security, he mixed everything and he tried to negotiate one thing for the other. And now we're going to see that, but reloaded, like version 2 point many things, it's going to be much more complicated because the world is much more complicated. And that sounds weird because we have in Mexico a president that has a very strong mandate, but I don't know if she has that kind of power. She has the mandate. I don't know if she has the power.
Well, this leads into a question that I wanted to ask you, Valeria, based on something you mentioned earlier, which was Mexican public opinion. And, we focused so much necessarily on what President Sheinbaum is doing and Marcelo Ebrard and this cast of political characters. What's your sense of how Mexican public opinion views this confrontation and what they want and expect their government to do?
Wow, that's a very tough question. Today in Claudia Sheinbaum's morning press conference, she said, Mexico is to be respected. That, touches people's, feelings towards the U.S. But at the same time, we feel the need to have a partnership with the U.S. So we are in a tough spot there as well. We do feel that Mexico, of course, should be respected. I think that's one of the things that we consider most important. But at the same time, we have this idea very much embedded in our DNA that we need the U.S. And you were mentioning some of the appointments of President Trump. And for example, when you were mentioning security and I don't know how to say it, but intervention or quiet intervention of the U.S. in Mexican security or Mexican internal domestic security issues, there are many people here, and it's very difficult for me to say this, but there are many people here in Mexico that actually agree on that said yes, because we need help. We need help addressing cartels, addressing organized crime, addressing what we are seeing in different parts of the country, in different regions of the country that have been almost absolutely taking control of the organized crime in the real activities. And when I say real, I mean the production of lemons, of poultry, of avocados, of, into so many sectors. But at the same time, of course, you will hear these phrases like Mexico has to be respected. And of course, we will not allow the U.S. military or U.S. intelligence, intervention, direct intervention. But we are not being able to deal with this organized crime participation in the real economy, in real sectors, in the day-to-day lives of millions of people. So we're in a very tough spot there as well.
We'll be back after a short break. The great journalist Alex Quadros has a new book out. It's called When We Sold God's Eye: Diamonds, Murder, and a Clash of Worlds in the Amazon. The book tells the story of the Cinta Larga, a tribe that had no contact with the outside world until the 1960s and came to run an illegal diamond mine in the Amazon. We'll be hosting Alex here at the Americas Society in New York City on January 15th to discuss the book. The event will be free of charge and followed by a reception. You can register on our website. That's americasquarterly.org. We hope to see you there. Valeria, I want to move on to the extent possible from the politics of this and do some hard critical thinking about the economics of it. As we look at the potential scenarios for the Mexican economy from this confrontation and also from what's happening more broadly with this new government, what do you see? How big is the range of possible outcomes, ranging from the pessimistic to the optimistic?
I am not seeing a disastrous scenario. I'm not seeing anything catastrophic like, the crisis that we had in 1994, 1995. I'm not seeing that. But what I am seeing is a continuous deterioration of many things: institutions, economic growth, trade institutions, regulatory framework. That's what I am seeing. And that goes to the medium and longer term perspectives for the Mexican economy.
So to be clear, you don't believe that there will eventually be a 25% tariff? There's widespread agreement that would cause a recession in Mexico. You don't think that's going to happen?
No, not at all. That would be a mess. It's not only a recession. That would be very complicated to deal with, not only in Mexico, as well in the US. And I think it would make many firms just unviable. You just can't deal with a 25% tariff. I think that's just, the starting point of negotiation for President Trump.
What I'm hearing from you then is more concern about the outlook under the Sheinbaum government more generally.
I mean, yes, they're intertwined. I am not saying that Mexico is building capacity for the future, for the medium-term growth. When we see the numbers that we're expecting for this year, for next year, they go around 1.4, 1.5. The medium average rate of growth expected for 2025 is 1.2. And if we take the median, it's only 1%. So no, it's not a recession. And that, of course, takes into consideration the tariff threats. So I am not saying a catastrophic event. I am not saying a catastrophic scenario, but I am saying a continuous deterioration of the numbers. We had numbers regarding employment and regarding informal employment, and they are indeed deteriorating. Investment has stagnated for the past, maybe 4 or 5 months. So investors are waiting to see if something very dramatic happens with President Trump. And they are not taking away their investment right now. But what worries me the most is that Mexico is not doing what we should do domestically to foster or to give an impulse to the Mexican economy. And that's without President Trump.
Well, I was going to ask you, Valeria, which president do you think Mexican investors are more concerned about, Donald Trump or Claudia Sheinbaum?
Now I think it's Trump, but I think it comes in waves. It comes in waves. For the first part of this year, investors were very worried about Claudia Sheinbaum, or worried about the decision that the Mexican economy would take. And now they're most worried about Trump. But at the same time, Brian, from the Mexican perspective, Mexican investors, and I am not talking about foreign investors, Mexican investors are worried about the reaction that Mexico should have to President Trump's threats, and eventual tariffs. That concern is very real, and is the thing that I think takes most of the mind space, the head space of Mexican investors right now.
So at America's Quarterly over the past year, we've heard a variety of perspectives about President Sheinbaum on both this podcast as well as in the articles that we've published. And the general view has been that from a business perspective, from an investment perspective, that there was an expectation that she would be slightly better in some ways than President López Obrador, that she was somebody who would do more on the energy transition, someone who was pragmatic, who, in some of her meetings during the transition period, met with leaders of companies large and small, listened to their concerns, acted, and so on, that this was really somebody who was going to take a tougher approach to security than President Lopez Obrador and address some of these challenges around organized crime. Then, came the whole judicial reform, which really soured a lot of people on Mexico generally and on President Sheinbaum specifically, because she was not just a proponent, but a seemingly enthusiastic proponent of the change. Where do you think we are now? I mean, have investors completely forgotten about this idea or discarded this idea that she might be, quote unquote, better? Or is there an expectation that over the course of the 6-year term that we might see a different kind of figure?
I think they're still making up their minds. I don't think, and this is a personal opinion, I don't think that she's more pragmatic than what President Lopez Obrador was. President Lopez Obrador at the beginning, Brian, he didn't even speak to businessmen or to investors. And then he realized that the Mexican economy had a very small and very mild recession during 2019. And then, of course, COVID hit. And in the moment of COVID, he started a conversation with businessmen, with investors. And with Claudia Sheinbaum, that conversation, has still been there. She listens to them, but she's much more ideological than he was. They are indeed optimistic, but they're not optimistic about the government. They're optimistic about the opportunities that Mexico still gives. They are very much aware that we are not moving towards a better or more investment-friendly economy, but they are still optimistic about the opportunity that Mexico has to give.
Valeria, let me ask you something that I've asked a couple of other podcast guests here with us. In the broadest possible sense, what do you believe that President Sheinbaum wants to accomplish during her 6-year term?
I don't know. I think that she wants to be the first real leftist president in Mexico.
Now, what you're saying by calling her the first is a bit controversial because you're implying that President Lopez Obrador was not.
I know, and I don't think he was at all. I mean, that there's one thing that you say and there's one thing that you do.
It's true, especially during the first 5 years of his term. President Lopez Obrador was very conservative on the fiscal front. 2023, 2024 was a different story. But you think that she has an agenda of essentially building out the state to offer more services and more benefits in a country, Mexico, that actually still has a very precarious, under-resourced state by Latin American standards.
Yes, you phrase it perfectly. That's what I think. However, the recent numbers don't show us that. So, it's her first budget. So let's see what happens. But her first budget is not moving towards this more inclusive or more, this rights agenda. Not at all. The health budget goes down, education budget goes down, infrastructure projects go down, environment goes down. So almost everything goes down. The only thing that goes up is housing. So that might be an interesting change.
Valeria, you mentioned the opportunities that are present in the Mexican economy, and there's been so much focus on nearshoring and so much disagreement among economists as to what extent it's actually happening. There are some economists who say, yes, it's clear. Maybe it's not happening at the dimension that some people say. And then we've had some guests on the show this year who have said that there's actually been very little change at all. What do you see happening right now? And what are the prospects now for nearshoring over the next year when you have a U.S. president holding this threat of tariffs over the economy, regardless of whether it's 25% or not? I mean, that has a chilling effect.
Hi, Brian. I would be in the second group of the economists that you mentioned. Numbers have not been that great if you try to define or to try to separate exactly what nearshore investment is. There have been some parts of the country that have been very much benefited by this wave of trade, I would say, not necessarily nearshoring. I mean, there's not necessarily been investment that has gone out of China or other Asian economies and flowed to the Mexican economy. I am not saying that at all. I am seeing an increase in trade, and that's important. But then again, we are not taking advantage of the opportunity that we could, because nearshoring, just a name, just the feeling that the nearshoring wave brought, could have made for President López Obrador and to current President Sheinbaum to make important changes, regarding, for example, the energy sector. That gave them a great narrative, like, yes, in order to take advantage of this nearshoring moment, we're going to do this and that regarding oil or regarding electricity or regarding rule of law or human capital or education. And we haven't done a thing.
Valeria, we've been speaking so much about what's happening at the decision-making level of both politics and the economy. We've been talking about presidents and investors and so on. I want to ask you a little bit more about what's happening at the grassroots in Mexico. We know that in the last couple of years, real wages have gone up. The minimum salary has gone up. These were all big reasons for Claudia Sheinbaum's massive election victory earlier this year and for a popularity that remains, especially by global standards, very high. What do you see happening at the grassroots of the Mexican economy right now? Is there any sign that this slowing of growth that we've seen this year is having an impact on people's real lives? Or is your average Mexican still pretty happy with the way things are going?
Wow. That's a tough one. Let me give you a couple of numbers, Brian. During President López Obrador term, real income increased by 33%. Real income. So if you add inflation to that, it's almost 70%. So real income increased 33%. It's a lot. When we studied the first courses on economy and they tell you that wages are equal to productivity, I mean, you go to the real life and sometimes you say like, well, that's not necessarily the case, but there should be something related to this. And so I studied the productivity for the same term, for the same six years, and productivity decreased 4%. So what we saw during the 6-year term of President López Obrador was that real income increased by 33%, while productivity decreased 4%. So there might be some catching up effect there. There might be some, resistance or stickiness. I mean, there might be many things going on. Trying to be forward-looking, that's going to be one of the main challenges of Claudia Sheinbaum. How to keep up with increasing wages, furthermore, real wages or real income. That's not only wages, but real income, while not having real changes in productivity. Let me be very honest with you. I think the average, if there is such a thing, Mexican is very happy. Consumption is growing. It has grown a lot. Social transfers are increasing. But how long can you keep on doing that? And President López Obrador, in a way, was very lucky to be able to do that. I don't know if Claudia Sheinbaum will be as lucky as he was.
Valeria, final question for you. It has to do with one more challenge facing the Mexican economy, which we did touch on earlier, but I want to come back at it again. And that's security. It's not a new issue in Mexico. These challenges around organized crime have been around for decades, but both anecdotally and in some recent data that has come out, it seems like the spread of cartels and other forms of organized crime into broad sectors of the economy really is becoming more of a challenge, not just from a social and quality of life point of view, but from a macroeconomic point of view as well. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
This week, a lime producer was killed. And the extortion fee that he was asked to comply with was 1 peso for every kilo of limes produced. How much of that tax, because it is a tax indeed, how much of that tax translates into the consumer prices? And that's lime. And you can do that for avocado and for corn, for tortillas. Apparently there's for the price that consumers pay for a kilogram of tortillas, and we eat a lot of tortillas, is 1 peso per kilogram. I mean, this is not the extortion fee. This is the price that goes into to the consumer. How much is that for poultry? And how much is that for construction materials? And how much is that? How can you deal with, for example, poultry that comes through customs illegally? Poultry, eggs, chicken. How can you deal with that? How does that affect prices? And we don't have a study and we don't have numbers on that, Brian. So yes, there is a very big challenge. I bet that for every single product that we buy at the supermarket, there is something going on there related to organized crime. So we're not talking only about drugs, or we're not talking only about kidnappings and these horrible things. We're talking about the inception of organized crime in a very deep root of the economy.
There are some early signs that President Sheinbaum is taking a different approach on this subject, after President Lopez Obrador's now famous abrazos no balazos, hugs not bullets strategy clearly did not work. His sexenio was, according to data, the most violent sexenio in recent Mexican history. There seems to be a recognition when I talk to Mexican officials that a new approach is needed. We've seen some signs of confrontation, a different approach since President Sheinbaum took office. Is this an area where you have some optimism?
Yes, there's a new approach. Right now, Brian, I am not that optimistic. It might change. Let me be very clear on this. It's way too early. I think that we will need help. Not necessarily the help that the U.S. or the president of the U.S. will be keen on giving, but we do need help. We're going to need a much more deep intervention than the intervention that we might have needed many years ago. Now it's much more complicated. It's kind of a disease that you let grow unchecked. And now you're going to have to deal with a much more complicated scenario. It's not only going to be the lungs. Now it's going to be the lungs and the liver and the pancreas. And, it's going to be much more complicated to get rid of it.
Valeria, thanks so much for joining us on the AQ podcast.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the America's Quarterly podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, give us a rating, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The America's Quarterly podcast is produced and edited by Luisa Franco. Our sound engineer is Gabriela Baez.